I think not so much a comment as a question to both Xolisa and Teng. We've discussed this issue many times. But the configuration at Warsaw was, I think, based, if you remember our discussions over the last 3 years, was a bit odd and surprising. And you saw some reflection of that in the number of comments received from Ambassador Saran's opening remarks, then other senior colleagues, who have worked on this issue for many years, their comment. So basically the problem is those guys, and we know who they are, those who are responsible, the Annex 1, the developed world, they are not simply doing their thing. They are investing in coal, and as Surya City said, they continue to consume. So why is it that we should enter? Okay? So I would like to know from your perspective, you are, the planes that, you spoke about the international community stepping in, and you very rightly made the point about Africa, that is, energy does not mean bulbs and, fans and stuff, or even air conditioning. Industrial energy is the key issue. So, you need the international community, etc. So why would you take this effort? What is the argument that developing countries, despite the fact of how this gap exists, the emissions gap, and how constantly developing countries feel as if the pressure is on them, nevertheless, why, in your opinion, why do you think, why would you think that developing countries must take an initiative? What's in it for us? If they are not doing it, why should we get in there? So, would you answer this head on?
If you listen to the point that Jennifer made earlier on, in the US, there's now a lot of buzz from an impact perspective. This is a country with a high adaptive capacity. So it's not an option for any developing country not to seek an international solution to this, precisely from that perspective, because it can only get worse.
Ambassador Saran has to leave for another engagement, but maybe we could just get some brief reflections from you before you leave for a couple of minutes, and then we can sort of get back to the...
No more group.
Why don't you just...
I must thank all the panelists for very, I would say for me, very instructive comments that they have. Let me just try and, before I leave, just give you a sense that at least as far as India is concerned, because I don't think we have really talked about what India has done in terms of climate change. We do have a climate change action plan, which was adopted in 2008. More importantly, while there has not been enough progress, I think, in each of the 8 missions which were elaborated in that plan, there have been very significant progress in at least some areas. So we have a very ambitious solar energy mission, which, contrary to expectations, in fact, the response to the launch of the mission has been far more positive than we had expected. And by the way, the financing of this mission is precisely using cheaper coal-based power to, in a sense, cross-subsidize more expensive solar power. But there has been considerable progress in terms of, in fact, today we are talking about further enlarging the scope of the solar mission. So that has been an important development. Second success has been in terms of another mission, which is the National Mission for Enhancing Energy Efficiency. And I think not many people know that in India we have a National Energy Conservation Act, which has 15 energy-intensive industries which have been listed in that act. Includes industry sectors like cement, thermal power, railways, plastics, chemicals, in a number of energy intensive. And for the first phase, 9 of these energy intensive sectors have been chosen for what is becoming now mandatory, observing mandatory benchmarks in terms of energy efficiency action. So there are, for each of these sectors and for the size of the installation or the unit involved, there are benchmarks which have been set. And these benchmarks have to be observed. If you do not meet your benchmark, then you pay a penalty. If you do better than the benchmark, you get a credit. And on that basis, some kind of a trading system is being put in place. So you can trade in efficiency credits in the market. Another major change that has taken place is that if you look at India's growth trajectory, what may appear to be rather, there has been an argument about subsidies to energy industry. But actually, if you look at India's energy prices in relation to, say, income levels, actually Indian energy prices are very high. And as a result of that, what you have seen over the last several years is, in fact, a significant reduction of energy intensity of growth. That is the amount of energy required for producing an additional dollar of GDP is now consistently going down. And that is a very, very good news. So I thought amidst all this gloom, perhaps also try and put across to you that there are, in fact, success stories in India. Maybe they are not looked upon as climate change action, but that is because unlike the developed world, these are issues which are completely intermingled with developmental issues, social issues. And therefore it is very difficult to separate, as it is done in the West. It's an emission issue. It is not just an emission issue in most developing countries. It is linked up with the whole issue of social and economic development. Energy poverty is a major reality in our countries, in a manner that perhaps the West fails to perhaps comprehend. So when we talk about emissions in developing countries, I think there is a certain justification for saying, look, our emissions are really survival emissions. They are not lifestyle emissions as far as developed countries are concerned. And I think that aspect has to be kept in mind. And lastly, before I leave, I just would like to make the point that whatever we do locally, and I think there is every reason for us to do much more of what we are doing, because it is in our interest, not because somebody is telling us to do this. It is in our interest. But at the end of the day, unless we are able to come up with a equitable burden sharing arrangement which is globally applicable, it is very difficult to see how we can actually make any progress in terms of dealing with this challenge. Because it is a global challenge. It is a challenge which does not recognize national boundaries or regional boundaries. It is therefore a global challenge. And to deal with this global challenge, you need a collaborative response of the kind that you spoke about. What has been happening very, very laudably at the local level or the city level, why is it not possible for us to raise it to the international level? Because what happens is that if I go to the negotiating chamber as a delegate from India, my brief is give as little as possible. Try and get as much as you can. I'm sure that is the brief for every single delegation which goes to these negotiations. So you end up with what I call the least common denominator result. And yet here is a challenge which needs not a minimal response but needs a maximal response. And that maximal response is only possible if the kind of collaboration that you spoke about is something which we can also raise it to the international level. And I think that is possible if we really realize that this is an elemental challenge for humanity. This is something which is important in terms of our future generations. If you can get that collaboration going, then I think you can deal with this problem. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We actually have a good chunk more time that we could use for further discussion. I think there's a lot more sort of appetite for discussion in the room, so perhaps Michele will carry on a little bit further. And the other reason to carry on is that we won't have any tea or samosas for another half an hour. So I think that's a compelling argument.
Okay, sorry.
Please.
Sorry, my apologies.
So maybe we can pursue this. Lavanya, did you have a
I actually just wanted to follow up on some of the sort of challenges that Xolisa had identified and bring Teng in on that actually. Challenges to the ERF actually. A lot of the challenges going forward have actually come from within the developing countries, and in a sense it could be argued that some developed countries have remained silent on this issue, perhaps hiding behind India and China that are sort of essentially pushing back on it. So rather than go into the details of why they're pushing back, I'm actually curious, Teng, if you could tell us a little bit more about the dynamics of coalition making in the international process. The LMDCs, or the like-minded developing countries that have emerged in the aftermath of Durban, includes India and China, doesn't include Brazil and South Africa. And part of what we saw in Warsaw was a very distinct split to some extent until the last day and a half, a very distinct split between at least South Africa and India and China. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more on the dynamics of sort of the LMDC coalition and the basic coalition, how the two of them interact with each other. Because we saw the like-minded developing countries sort of really dominate until the last day and a half of Warsaw, and then you had the basic come in and actually end the conference on a basic note. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the dynamics of that India-China relationship and the coalitions that they're part of.
I'm trying to give some of my personal observation because of this dynamics is still evolving dynamics, and we still have to observe that what means for the future's negotiation. But generally, I think that it is easier to understand that in the negotiations, as a separate or as individual countries, it will be difficult for you to prevent your interests. So it will be much easier if you act as a group. If you act as a group during the negotiations, that is generally the basic idea that why parties came together as a group. And the previous traditional developing country group is the G77 and China. But because of the diversity of that group, it became much more difficult to form a group position in the negotiations. And that means it is becoming more difficult for some developing countries to prevent their national interest in the negotiation. That is why within this G77 China's you can observe more and more subgroup emerging from this traditional developing country group, and basic countries and also the LMDCs is only two of them, but not all of those subgroups. And according to my observation, the LMDC developing countries, if you try to understand what bring those developing countries together, I have to see that from my personal observation, the reason to bring those developing countries together to form LMDC group, the major reason is they are trying to prevent the traditional division between developing country and developed country, the annex division. That is one common interest that they are going to prevent from the negotiations. But for the basic countries, that may be a little bit different. The basic country, firstly, there are four biggest developing countries in the several continents, which is very important. And if you look at the dynamics between LMDC and basic countries, from perspective of Chinese researchers, I think Lavanya have given a very interesting observation. It is the like-minded developing countries always looks like kind of left-wing group of countries that they based on the convention and don't want to see any division from the convention. But for the basic countries, my perspective is, at least for Brazil and South Africa, I see they are more flexible. They follow a more cooperative way than China does and also than India does. So it's very difficult to ask basic country to take such a strong position. But it is possible for like-minded country to take this very strong position. But if you look at almost every negotiation, you will find that the final solution came from basic country, not from like-minded countries. The final solution is always the compromise between basic countries and Western world, not like-minded countries. Like-minded countries seem to disappear at the very last minute, although before the very last minute, they're a very strong voice.
If I could just quickly follow up.
Yeah, the perspectives are very divided. Some people see China as India's biggest ally, and some people see China as using India as a shield.
Yeah.
And that's really, and there's a big division between those. So of course, don't feel like you're on the spot. But there's a lot of interest in understanding this relationship better from the Chinese side.
Okay, well, that may be the most sensible part for me, but I'm trying to give a very frank answer from my personal perspective. I see this line is not a line between India and China, but a line for the second and the first and second largest developing country parties. The climate change is a challenge for the whole world, but the biggest challenge is for developing country parties. We are going to shift towards a low carbon development path. This never happened before. And it is a task and it is an obligation of China and India to indicate a possible way out, not only for China and India, but for the whole developing country world. That is why we should and we must bring China and India together to achieve this kind of challenge as leadership in the developing country world. And we do have a lot of difference between us, but the common interest we also have many. And the most important one for me is we have to identify a way out and how to develop our economy to a range of maybe, if you give numbers, something like 6% to 10% per year in a carbon constrained world. This challenge is a real challenge for us. This challenge is different from developed countries. Their annual growth rate is something like 2% or 3%. And the level of challenge is quite different. And we have deal with challenge and we have identified way. And at this stage, the option for us is try to maintain some kinds of flexibility in terms of non-legally binding, in terms of magnitude, in terms of intensity-based target. That is commonality we have found before that try to accommodate this kind of serious challenge for us. And in the future, we are going to find some other possible solution together that to accommodate. But that doesn't mean that China and India is going to leave this climate challenge. That only means that China and India should came together, should identify a common approach, identify solutions for developing country worlds. That is the common basis for China and India to become a line. But this line is not a line to blocking migration. This line is not a line that to move negotiation forward. This line is not a line that to move to a less ambitious mitigation efforts. This is not the common interest of China and India. The common interest is how to achieve the development in a carbon constrained world. That is the biggest point for me and why China and India should stand together in terms of this.
So let me perhaps give some of the others a chance. Daman at the back, and then.
Thank you, Navroz. My name is Damandeep Singh. I work with CDP, formerly known as Carbon Disclosure Project. My question is actually to you and Navroz and to Lavanya as to see why isn't there an industry representative on this panel? We've had a report in The Guardian that says 90% of 90 companies cause 2/3 of anthropogenic climate change issues. So isn't that the way to address those? And that will probably lead into the question that this young gentleman asked, and also what Professor Grubb said, that if we get these companies to take action and to reduce their emissions, we probably have the beginnings of some action on climate change. Why, great ambassadors and diplomats discuss on global treaty. Thank you.
My question is to this August panelists that energy systems are the key to the climate change concerns and response. So what kind of investment policies in energy policy, what kind of investment, is there any policy existing, and what kind of investment should be made? Like, of course, we are doing that as Mr. Saran explained, but still, is there any guideline on that aspect for response to the climate change?
The mics. We began with very pessimistic projections of the prospects for Paris 2015. I just wanted to offer briefly a few points which might dissipate the gloom. One, the recession which started in 2009 is now definitely over. In a recession such as we had, it was very difficult for the industrialized countries to project any kind of measures, even in the long run, which would impede their future growth. So that, I think, danger we're now getting out of. Secondly, the Obama administration is at its bottom just now, but it is also, I think, likely before 2015 to have recovered some of its elan, and it is possible, at least, that the American administration will be in a position to offer constructive leadership, without which, obviously, we're not going to get anywhere. Thirdly, it's significant that IPCC 5 was not received with glee by the Neanderthalers, because it did have the original proposition that recent rise in temperatures has not been that great. Nevertheless, despite that provocation, you did not have any concerted response saying climate change is nonsense. That's hopeful. Fourthly, as Professor Grubb has mentioned, that it seems, at least to the non-specialist, that considerable progress has been made in many technologies. I hope also in carbon sequestration and capture and sequestration. Things like that would be helpful because it would mean less pressure on growth. That was 4. 5 is that the big hope at one time was that there would be a Tobin tax. Now that was talked out completely at the time, but recently in a completely different context of financial restructuring in Europe, the Tobin tax has made a distinct comeback. It's no longer a pipe dream. So if a Tobin tax on financial transactions can be considered as to accumulate funds for stabilizing the world financial system, if that happens, it will very much strengthen the case for doubling that tax for financing the climate, the dissemination of climate change technologies to low-income countries.
Thank you. It was prompted by there being somebody from the CDP in the room, but also by something that Michael said. You talked about, and I like that when you said, think about focusing on consumers rather than focusing on, or consumption rather than production, because producer interests are a blockage to policy. And I wonder where in that argument finance fits. Because the arguments of financiers and the arguments of manufacturers are not the same on this issue, it seems to me. And CDP in part emerges because institutional investors wanted to put pressure on the companies they invest in to disclose emissions, etc., etc. And so that then also connects to the other parts of the question about money. So if you've got $100 billion, or whatever, there's various sums of money being expressly needed to generate investment, that's also the investment that deals with consumption. Because if you want to get people out of their cars, you've got to invest in new forms of. You can't do that by just saying get out your cars. It's about investment, and therefore there's a whole set of questions about the things that, to my mind, that Michele said earlier on about how do you mobilise actions through private organisations like CDP connecting to FCCC activities in the intergovernmental sphere, connecting to building new new lines of the metro in Delhi. And how does that all start? So A, where does money fit into that picture, and how does it also help us think about connections between different activities going on?